I always knew family wasn't supposed to feel like a battlefield, but with mine, it often did. Megan and I had worked hard to build a life we loved, a quiet, comfortable home on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, long weekend getaways, and no kids. Just us, a few close friends, and a dog named Baxter. I thought we had it all figured out. Freedom, financial stability, and the ability to wake up on a Saturday without stepping on Legos or tripping over toy trucks. But not everyone in my family shared that perspective. Tina and Emily, my two older sisters, were on a different path entirely. Stay-at-home moms with minivans full of cracker crumbs and juice stains, both were raising packs of unruly kids while their husbands, Rob and Brian, cycled between working hard and drinking harder. Megan always said their bitterness was about more than just lifestyle differences. She'd noticed the small things, the glances exchanged when we mentioned our annual trips to the mountains, or when Megan mentioned we were eyeing another investment property. My sisters' smiles never quite reached their eyes. And then there was the cabin, a gorgeous retreat tucked away in the Cascade Mountains. I'd bought it quietly, as a surprise gift to my parents when they retired. Officially, the deed was in my name, but I never waved that fact around. The cabin was supposed to be a place for my parents to enjoy, maybe host family getaways now and then. Megan and I didn't use it often ourselves, preferring to leave it open for Mom and Dad. But deep down, I knew if Tina and Emily ever found out the place was mine, it would be a powder keg. Unfortunately, that fuse was about to be lit. The invitation came on a humid Thursday evening. Megan and I had just finished dinner when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mom. Family BBQ this Saturday. Bring Megan. I sighed and slid the phone across the table to Megan. She read it, grinned, and arched an eyebrow. You already saying no in your head, aren't you? I chuckled. Guilty. I didn't need to check the guest list to know Tina, Emily, Rob, and Brian would be there, with their kids too. The last family event we attended had ended in chaos, with Tina's twins nearly setting fire to the backyard grill while my parents pretended nothing was wrong. Megan leaned back in her chair, her usual optimism softening her voice. I know they're exhausting, but it might be nice to see your folks. I hesitated. She wasn't wrong. My parents were good people, even if they were blind to their daughter's antics. Before I could answer, my phone pinged again. This time, it was Emily. You two better show up. Don't flake like you always do. Megan peeked over at the screen and sighed. Well, they're already starting. Still, there was a flicker of guilt. Megan was always the bigger person, more forgiving, more patient. I nodded reluctantly. All right, but 1 drink, 2 burgers, and we're out. Deal, she smiled. Little did we know, this BBQ wouldn't be just another awkward afternoon. It would be the spark that set everything in motion. Saturday arrived faster than expected. As Megan and I pulled up to my parents' suburban Oregon home, I could already hear the chaotic symphony of laughter, music, and kids shouting from the backyard. The yard was decked out in red, white, and blue decorations, left over from a belated 4th of July theme. The grill was fired up, smoke curling lazily into the sky, and the familiar scent of burgers and ribs filled the air. We stepped inside and were immediately greeted by my mom, bustling between the kitchen and the patio, her face flushed from heat and stress. There you are, she beamed, hugging us both. Your sisters have been asking when you'd show. I exchanged a look with Megan. Tina and Emily were already planted in lounge chairs by the pool, margaritas in hand, their husbands beside them sipping beers. Their kids ran wild, weaving between guests like caffeinated tornadoes. Rob spotted us first, raising a bottle lazily. Look who finally decided to join the party. Brian smirked. Better late than never, huh? I forced a polite smile, but Megan could sense my patience thinning. We navigated through the yard, greeting a few of the neighbors, some of whom we actually liked. My dad waved from the whirlpool section of the pool, content with a cold beer and a safe distance from the chaos. The food was great, the conversation less so. Tina and Emily took turns lobbing passive-aggressive comments our way. No kids yet? Tina asked with a sly grin. Guess you two don't like sharing your vacations, Emily chimed in. Megan squeezed my hand under the table. We'd both heard it all before. But as the sun dipped lower and the frozen margaritas flowed, something shifted. The kids grew bolder, louder, their parents too distracted to notice. And then, the first shove happened. One of the neighbor guests, chatting near the pool's edge, stumbled as Tina's twins gleefully pushed her. She caught herself on the steps, soaked, but not fully submerged. Megan and I locked eyes. Something about today felt different, like we were standing at the edge of a much bigger storm. The neighbor dried off quietly, brushing it off with a tense smile before leaving without a word. Meanwhile, Tina and Emily roared with laughter, raising their glasses as if their kids had pulled off a harmless prank. But the air shifted. A few other guests exchanged uneasy glances, and I noticed Megan's grip on my arm tighten. "I think we should leave," she whispered. I nodded, but hesitated. Leaving now would just hand Tina and Emily another win, and I wasn't ready to give them the satisfaction. Minutes later, as Megan chatted with my mom near the grill, I found myself standing near the pool, casually talking to a neighbor about weekend getaways. That's when I caught them, the twins and Emily's 9-year-old son, sprinting toward me from across the yard, their eyes locked on me like heat-seeking missiles. I didn't even think. I just sidestepped at the last second. The 3 kids couldn't stop in time. With a collective splash, they flew headfirst into the deep end of the pool. For a split second, the backyard fell silent. Then chaos erupted. The kids surfaced, sputtering and crying. Shouts rang out as my sisters bolted to the edge of the pool, drunk and panicked. Rob and Brian stumbled after them, slurring curses as they tried to fish their drenched kids out of the water. "They can't swim," Tina screamed. My stomach dropped for a second, until I remembered that these kids practically lived in this pool every summer. They'd be fine. Still, the drama had only just begun. "You just stood there," Emily bellowed at me as Brian hauled her son out by the arm. "You let them fall in." "You should have taken the hit," Rob growled, sloshing water from his beer can as he gestured wildly. Megan rushed over, furious. "Are you seriously blaming him for your kids running wild?" Tina, eyes glassy and red, pointed a shaky finger at me. "You could have ruined everything. The phones. The kids were filming." It took me a second to process what she meant. 2 smartphones lay at the bottom of the pool, no doubt belonging to Rob and Brian. "You're kidding," I muttered. But no, they weren't. Their rage only grew, fueled by alcohol and bruised egos. I glanced around, noticing that most of the neighbors had quietly gathered their things, retreating from the powder keg unfolding in my parents' backyard. Megan tugged on my arm again. "We're leaving." And this time, I agreed. As we walked away, Rob's voice echoed after us. "You could have just played along, but no, you always have to ruin it." I didn't turn back. I just knew this wasn't over yet. That night, Megan and I sat in silence on the couch, nursing glasses of wine while the echoes of the backyard disaster played on, repeat in my head. Neither of us spoke for a long time until Megan finally broke the silence. "They're never going to change," she said quietly. I nodded. I think this was the last straw. Before either of us could say more, my phone buzzed. I sighed, expecting it to be one of the sisters unleashing more drunken texts. Instead, it was my mom. "Hey," I answered cautiously. "Your father and I, we're so sorry," she began, her voice shaky. "We never expected them to act like that. We told them to apologize, but..." "Mom, it's not your fault," I interrupted, "but we're done with them." Megan gave me a supportive nod as my mom sighed heavily on the other end. "We don't blame you," she admitted. "Your father's furious. He's already told them they're banned from using the cabin for now." That caught my attention. "They've been using the cabin?" I asked sharply. There was a pause. "Well, yes, for short weekends," she admitted hesitantly. "We thought it was harmless." I felt the heat rising behind my eyes. Megan sat up straighter, her instincts kicking in. "For free?" I pressed. Mom hesitated again. "Actually, we think they've been renting it out." My stomach dropped. "Wait, They've been making money off my cabin? Without telling me? Megan asked, incredulous. We just found out, Mom said quickly. Your father's livid. We're both upset, but we didn't want to ruin things. Megan let out a hollow laugh. Too late for that? I ended the call shortly after, assuring my parents we'd talk later. Once I hung up, Megan looked at me. This has to stop, she said. I knew she was right. I spent the rest of the night changing the locks remotely on the cabin's smart system. The next day, I made calls to hire a property manager, someone who could keep watch and handle maintenance. No more favours, no more loopholes. The final step was blocking both my sisters and their husbands on every device we owned. Megan raised her glass to me as I pressed the final block. To peace and quiet, she said. To peace and quiet, I echoed. But deep down, I had a sinking feeling the storm wasn't over just yet. A few days later, David, the new property manager I hired, called me. You might want to sit down for this, he said. I was already sitting at my office desk, but I braced myself. Go ahead. I did a full sweep of the cabin and found a few things that don't add up, David explained. First off, there were recent signs of heavy use. Mud tracked through the foyer, missing firewood, some kitchenware gone. But the kicker? I found a folder tucked behind the breaker panel. My heart sank. A folder? Yeah, David confirmed. Booking records, cash payments, lists of guests. Looks like your sisters have been renting out the cabin to strangers for the last 2 years. I clenched my jaw, trying to process the betrayal. 2 years. They've made tens of thousands, David added. Easily. I muttered a curse under my breath. What do you want me to do? He asked. Lock everything down, reset all codes, I ordered, and get me pictures of the records. Later that night, Megan and I sat in front of my laptop, scrolling through photos David had sent. Pages upon pages of handwritten notes, guest names, stay dates, cash amounts, even rental agreements drafted by my sisters. They've been running a whole damn business behind our backs, Megan said in disbelief, and they've kept every dollar. As furious as I was, it all made sense now. The weird family friends mentioning great weekend getaways, the repairs that seemed excessive, the excuses whenever the cabin seemed booked. They've been using the cabin like it's their personal Airbnb, I muttered. Megan crossed her arms. We need to do something, like legal action. Agreed, I said. But first, let's see how far they're willing to push this. The next day, I drove up to the cabin with David to inspect everything in person. On the way, David filled me in on the sheriff's department up there. They don't play around, he said, especially when it comes to property disputes. When we arrived, I couldn't believe my eyes. There was damage everywhere, scratched hardwood floors, scuffed walls, broken light fixtures. They'd treated my parents' retreat like a frat house rental. As we left the cabin, David pointed toward the gate. By the way, I found fresh tire marks leading up to here. Someone tried getting in after I installed the new lock. I stared at the deep ruts in the gravel. They're not going to stop, I said. Nope, David replied, but we're ready. As I drove home, one thing became crystal clear. This wasn't just about family anymore. This was theft, and it was personal. It happened sooner than I thought. The following Friday, just as Megan and I were settling in for a quiet evening, my phone buzzed. It was David. They're at the cabin, he said calmly. Who? I asked, though I already knew. Your brothers-in-law, Rob and Brian. They cut through the gate with an angle grinder and are trying to break into the main house. Cameras caught everything. My stomach tightened. I've already called the sheriff's office, David continued. They're sending deputies now. I thanked him and immediately pulled up the live feed from the security cameras. There they were, Rob and Brian, fumbling with the cabin's front door, visibly drunk, laughing like teenagers breaking into an abandoned mall. I felt my blood boil. 10 minutes later, I saw red and blue lights flash on the screen. 2 sheriff's deputies stepped out of their patrol cars, hands resting near their belts. Rob and Brian tried to play it off like they belonged there, but the deputies weren't buying it. Within minutes, they were cuffed and sitting on the gravel driveway, heads hanging low, I could almost hear them complaining from hundreds of miles away. Later that night, David texted me pictures of them being booked at the county jail. The fallout began almost immediately. My parents called me in a panic the next morning, voices shaky and desperate. "You have to drop the charges," my mom pleaded. "They're your family." "No," I replied coldly. "They broke into my property. They vandalized it." "They didn't know about the cameras," she added, as if that excused their actions. "That's the problem," I snapped. "They thought they'd get away with it." After I hung up, Megan placed a hand on my shoulder. "They're in jail because of their own choices." I nodded. I'm done playing the nice guy. As we sat in silence, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Rob. "Hey, it's just a misunderstanding. Let's talk." I blocked the number without a second thought. The next few days were chaos. My parents kept calling, begging for leniency. My sisters left voicemails dripping with anger and desperation, switching between demanding and pleading. Megan and I stayed firm. Then came the tipping point. My dad, usually the calmest voice in the room, called me late one night. His voice was steady but carried a weight I hadn't heard before. "Son," he sighed, "your mother and I are stepping back. We're done getting caught in the middle." I paused, unsure what to say. "We love you," he continued, "but we also know you're right. Your sisters crossed the line." It was the first time I'd ever heard him fully side with me. Relief washed over me, tempered only by the sadness of how fractured things had become. The next morning, I took action. I contacted my lawyer and instructed him to push forward with charges. At the same time, we drafted a formal letter for Rob and Brian, making our position crystal clear. Pay for all damages, accept a no-contact order, or face the full consequences. Days later, a courier delivered a letter to my office from the brothers-in-law. Inside was a surprisingly contrite apology and a $5,000 cashier's check. The apology felt hollow. Still, my attorney recommended accepting it, along with strict terms that included a civil no-contact agreement between us and both couples. Reluctantly, they signed. Megan and I sat quietly at home that evening. "You okay?" she asked. I took a sip of coffee and nodded. "It feels surreal. Like we've finally drawn the line they can't cross," she smiled. "And it's about time." For the first time in years, I felt the storm beginning to pass. In the weeks that followed, the silence was almost unsettling. No more passive-aggressive texts, no more unexpected calls or guilt-tripping messages. Megan and I were free, and the weight that had clung to our shoulders for years was finally lifting. The cabin, once a source of family tension, now felt like our sanctuary. David, the caretaker, regularly sent us serene photos of sunsets, deer wandering near the property, and peaceful mornings shrouded in mist. Each picture was a reminder that this place was ours, and that it was finally safe. One evening, Megan and I sat on the porch at the cabin, sipping wine beneath a sky peppered with stars. The air was crisp, the kind of stillness that made every sound carry. "I can't believe it took this long," Megan murmured. "Yeah," I replied, glancing toward the towering pines. "But we got here, finally." I felt the cabin's quiet embrace, far removed from the chaos we left behind. We had reclaimed our peace. Occasionally, my parents would visit the cabin, enjoying the escape without the baggage my sisters brought. The quiet conversations, the long walks by the lake, and the lack of conflict brought us closer than we'd been in years. It wasn't perfect. Some scars from my sister's betrayal would never fully heal. But this peace, was ours. And as Megan leaned her head on my shoulder, I realized something. Letting go of toxic family ties didn't mean losing family altogether. It just meant choosing the right ones. It was late October when the inevitable happened. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Todd?" Tina's voice trembled on the other end. "We need to talk. Please." For a split second, I considered hanging up, but curiosity won out. "What is it, Tina?" I said sharply. "I know we signed the agreement, but we need to meet one last time," she pleaded, face to face. Against Megan's advice, I agreed, but only at a public cafe in town. Megan came along, sitting nearby to keep an eye on things. When Tina and Emily arrived, both looked worn down, far from the entitled women I was used to. No smug smiles, no self-righteous attitudes, just desperation. Tina broke the silence first. "We're selling our house," she confessed. "We're drowning in debt." Emily nodded, looking equally defeated. "We've lost everything," she whispered. "The cars, the vacations, the lifestyle." Tina leaned forward. "We're not here to ask for money." Her voice was soft, shaky. "We just wanted to say we were wrong." I studied their faces, searching for a hint of manipulation. But all I saw was resignation. "We let our jealousy ruin everything," Emily added. "We thought you owed us." "And you don't," Tina finished, voice cracking. "You never did." I stayed quiet, letting their words hang in the air. Finally, I replied, "I hope you mean that. But forgiveness? That's going to take time." Tina wiped away a tear. "We understand." I stood up, ready to leave, but not before offering one last olive branch. "I hope you figure things out, for your kids' sake." They nodded, and Megan and I walked out into the brisk autumn air. As we drove home, Megan reached over and squeezed my hand. "You did the right thing." Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. But what I knew for certain was this. I finally had closure. Winter came early to Oregon that year. The first snow dusted the pine trees surrounding the cabin, and Megan and I found ourselves sipping coffee by the large picture window, watching the flakes fall. The place felt lighter now. No hidden resentment, no unwanted visitors, no undercurrent of family drama lurking around the corner. Just us and the serenity of the woods. We spent that weekend decorating the cabin for the holidays. Megan strung up fairy lights along the porch while I chopped firewood. Inside, we placed a small Christmas tree near the fireplace, filling the air with the scent of pine. In the evenings, we cooked simple meals, shared wine, and talked about plans for the future. The kind of conversations we hadn't had in years, not without interruption from family drama. "I think we should rent this place out ourselves," Megan said one night as we watched the flames dance. "But only to people we trust. Friends, co-workers, maybe even a charity retreat." I smiled. "Not a bad idea. But we keep it ours first." Megan grinned. "Ours first, always." We also began spending more time with my parents. Without Tina and Emily hovering around, the visits were warm and genuine. My dad even cracked a joke about finally having peace during family dinners. For once, it felt like we were writing a new chapter, one where guilt and obligation no longer dictated our choices, one where boundaries were respected. Megan and I planned our first New Year's trip abroad since cutting ties with my sisters. Just the two of us. No distractions, no passive-aggressive comments about our child-free lifestyle. As the snow blanketed the cabin that night, I realized this wasn't just about reclaiming a vacation home. It was about reclaiming our life. 1 year later. Megan and I returned to the cabin, this time under the soft glow of a golden autumn. The air was crisp, and the leaves painted the landscape in hues of amber and crimson. Life had changed dramatically since that chaotic summer. The no-contact agreement with my sisters and their husbands remained firmly in place. There were no more late-night calls, no unexpected visits, no drama-filled holidays. The absence of conflict had brought a calm neither Megan nor I knew we needed. The cabin thrived too. With David continuing as the caretaker, it became a cherished retreat, not just for us, but for a select few friends and co-workers we occasionally invited. It never became a business, just a shared piece of tranquility for those we trusted. My parents respected the new boundaries, choosing to visit separately without bringing up Tina or Emily. Our relationship with them grew stronger, based on mutual understanding rather than obligations. Megan and I explored new hobbies, took spontaneous trips, and, for the first time, talked seriously about what legacy we wanted to leave. Not for ungrateful family members, but for causes and people we genuinely cared about. One quiet evening at the cabin, as we sat on the porch watching the stars emerge over the tree line, Megan squeezed my hand. "We did the right thing," she whispered. I nodded, feeling the truth settle deep within me. No guilt, no resentment, just freedom. We had broken free from a toxic cycle and built something healthier, stronger, on our terms. And as the night air grew colder, wrapping us in its stillness, I realized this was peace, and it was ours to keep